What you're looking at right now is largely AI generated. And those of you who are familiar with AI generated work can probably tell. There's some elements to this that are clearly not done with intent, some elements that are sort of like blurry or smudgy. But then there are also elements that indicate at least some thought went into this, at least some clear and intentional design. And you might find yourself wondering, what is this reminding me of? Well, hopefully it's reminding you of the world map from Ocarina of Time. To try and make a long story short, growing up I was terrible at video games, but loved Ocarina of Time, to the point that I spent more time reading the instruction manual than playing the game. And I don't mean the first time, I mean rereading it, sort of treating it like a collector's art book. I just really liked the aesthetic of it. Anyway, 7 years after 7 years later, I'm running a D&D game that is a little more eccentric than it ought to be, because it takes place within the world of a lost media video game that doesn't exist. I'm also running a YouTube channel at the time, so it's obviously my goal to turn this into a sort of high production affair, while at the same time not having a lot of resources to do that with. Prior to the advent of AI generated imagery, I was already creating a channel that was more transformative work than it was original work. I mean, most of our videos are just of us playing video games. I am under no illusion that that is original work. It's more of a reaction video than anything. It's akin to a let's play. And you'll see this sort of lack of concern for originality when you look at other work within the genre. They make heavy use of stock imagery with the watermark still on it, or, barely edited grunge assets that are not intended to be the highest production value of original work. They're just meant to be a piece in what is essentially a larger collage of transformative work. Anyway, this is a big reason why AI generated art was sort of a no-brainer for this project, because having played around with it a little bit at this point, I had begun to understand that it is mostly just a papier-mâché slurry of whatever aesthetics or ideals that you're trying to convey. And knowing how AI art worked at the time, I knew that I could take a pretty basic line art outline of the city that I wanted to portray and sort of paint over it with the connotation of classic Ocarina of Time. Anyway, rather than argue how much work I did versus how much of it was just plagiarism with extra steps, I would rather let my process speak for itself. Alright, so ask anybody how AI generated imagery works, and they're probably going to say that you tell a computer what you want it to draw, and it draws it. That's not entirely true. Anytime that you're dealing with a prompt-based system, what you're really doing is telling a computer what to draw. It draws the completely wrong thing. And you argue with the computer until the image gets worse and worse and worse. I wasn't interested in that at the time, and I really preferred something called stable diffusion, which was a diffusion-based model that starts with image noise that it slowly adjusts over time. And you can use different plugins to shape that noise as you're working with it. So typically whenever people were accusing me of just telling a computer what to draw, it wasn't even an accurate burn, because I was doing unprompted work. I wasn't typing very much into the actual generator other than maybe Fantasy Town. And a large part of the actual work was the manipulation of the original source imagery and the various plugins that are designed to paint the aesthetic into those lines. Really closer to just tracing or coloring in a coloring book than anything else. So what I did was I started here. This was generated in Azgaar's fantasy world generator. It's the city of Sigillario, generic walled city in a fantasy world where generic walled cities are decently commonplace. But this works great because it's line art with a decent amount of space in the lines, so that's going to work really well for something called ControlNet. As of recording this, the image generator in ChatGPT actually kind of does something similar to ControlNet, but at the time it couldn't do that. What this means is whenever it's generating the image, the noise is kind of trying to stay constrained to the lines that you've set to be the lines. Those are the lines that it gets to use. Deal with it. You can paint your picture in those lines. And then on top of that, I used an extension called IP adapter, which you can feed various reference images And it uses those to try to constrain the general aesthetic of what it's generating within those lines. So, back to Zelda. This abomination is a big collage of 3D Hyrule maps. Why did I do this big collage instead of just one map? Because if I had used just one map, it would have tried very hard to put the desert over here to the west and to put a lake over here to the southeast, because it would be trying to largely fit the Hyrule map into the lines. That wasn't what I was trying to do. I was really just trying to give it a big reference image so that it can get a general idea of the patterns, the colors, the vibe of the picture. And that seemed to work pretty well once I created this big mosaic of them. I also fed this image into it because obviously I would. From there, I went in and I tried it on various different settings to get various different drafts. And you can see just sort of like the extent of what happens whenever you crank the strength. And eventually, for example, my walls disappeared. And I very barely used the outline that I'd provided versus, barely touching the original source image. I also went ahead and created this photoshopped image of Hyrule Castletown to give it the red rooftops, to sort of like provide a frame of reference that these red buildings are red rooftopped village buildings. And sort of over time, tinkering with it, I was able to turn it into this. Now you may have noticed there's not a river here. And that really comes down to, what it's like to run a D&D game more than the actual image generation. Because whenever I first conceptualized this town, there wasn't a river there. And then over the course of telling the story, I wound up describing this Castile as being next to a river almost entirely for the purpose of having various different points of entry to the castle. I wanted there to be like a seaside cave entrance. I wanted there to be like a way for them to have a dramatic exit out the window over the cliffs into the water. We wound up not doing any of that, but I had already described the river being there. So all I really had to do was basically like crayon draw a blue line up the side, and through a couple of generations, we wound up with a river. I used a similar process for the opening credits to the video. You will notice, hopefully, that it's got an almost stop motion claymation look to it. And that was really me trying to take advantage of one of the limitations of Stable Diffusion, in that Stable Diffusion wasn't anything like current gen ChatGPT image generation, where you could never rely on it to be consistent. It just wasn't going to do that. So I said, screw it. If it's not going to be consistent, let's give it that weird stop motion look where there's a little bit of jank between each frame. So what we did was a party member of ours, Tanner Cash, hand illustrated character artwork that I used to train models to paint over these images to create that effect. And in case you're not impressed with that, at least somebody with a real big boy job doing this sort of thing also had the same idea, because the opening credits for Marvel's Secret Invasion uses the exact same technique and the exact same software, Stable Diffusion, to create that sort of weird, dreamy look to it. Anyway, like I said, I'm making this video for my portfolio, but if you happen to cross it on my YouTube channel, hi, my name is Gatsby. I have awful ADHD and way too many ideas that I don't have the patience to finish on my own, and have therefore come up with various convoluted processes to try and figure out how to complete tasks that my peers and role models have completed with much less difficulty. Anyway, I'm going to end this video before I embarrass myself further. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.